The new haircut appears and oh no reaches your friend before the smile or the answer you meant to give. Normally, a fraction of a second lets you inspect that reaction and decide whether it is fair, useful, or even what you actually think. In this world, the chosen response is still forming when the damage is already done. Nearby minds are leaking too. Judgments, worries, song fragments, hunger, and ideas that were never meant to become conversation. The first thing society loses is not secrecy about grand crimes. It is the tiny pause between reaction and reply. That leaked "oh no" sounds like a sentence, which makes the whole disaster look simple. Private speech has suddenly become public. The trouble is that thought does not arrive in one standard format. In one experience sampling study, inner speech appeared in only 26% of sampled moments, while inner seeing appeared in 34% and unsymbolized thinking in 22%. Unsymbolized thinking means you can know, intend, compare, or sense something without hearing words or seeing a clear picture. The variation between people was even larger. 5 of the 30 participants experienced no inner speech in their samples, while one person experienced it in 75% of them. That is not a minor difference. One mind may produce sentences, another images, another bodily tension, or a wordless sense that something is wrong. The result would not be billions of identical radio stations, but mixed signals with no universal format. Would an image arrive as an image, a feeling as pressure, and a wordless idea as instant understanding? Or would every mental event need to be translated into something others could recognize? Even if every signal arrived perfectly labeled and perfectly clear, a harder ambiguity would remain. The thought might still not represent what its owner believes. Your mind predicts that the plane will crash, flashes an image of dropping your phone, produces a burst of irritation, or suggests a ridiculous action you reject before it becomes a plan. These are different events. A prediction is not a judgment, an image is not a desire, an impulse is not an intention, and none of them is an action. The mind produces possibilities constantly, including possibilities the person dislikes, fears, or immediately dismisses. In one study, 93.6% of 7777 university students across 13 countries reported at least one unwanted intrusive thought during the previous 3 months. Almost everyone in the sample had experienced mental content they did not ask for and did not necessarily endorse. That does not make every passing thought harmless, but it does make one thing clear. Unwanted content is ordinary, not a secret confession waiting to escape. Inside your own mind, you can notice the thought, reject it, reconsider it, or let it disappear without giving it social meaning. A listener would receive the fragment first and the rejection second if the rejection arrived at all. Therefore, the thinker can still reject the thought, while the listener mostly hears what came before the rejection. Once thoughts stop looking like reliable confessions, the public feed becomes less a catalog of secrets and more a flood of material that may have nothing to do with the person hearing it. Now, put that mixed, unfinished feed into an ordinary meeting, where one person discusses deadlines while another thinks about lunch and a third suddenly remembers something embarrassing from 8 years ago. On a date, the conversation competes with a song fragment, physical discomfort, comparison, hope, and the private fear of saying the wrong thing. In a classroom, the lesson shares the room with hunger, an unanswered message, an old memory, and physical discomfort. At a family dinner, affection and irritation sit beside tomorrow's errands, a half-finished worry, and a completely unrelated question about where someone left the charger. Even while listening to a friend, your attention can briefly leave, return, and leave again, without your deciding that the friend no longer matters. An experience sampling study followed 2,250 adults and found that they were thinking about something other than their current activity in 46.9% of sampled moments. In that study, the mind was elsewhere in nearly half the sampled moments. What emerged would be several competing streams, not a deeper version of the conversation. Noise alone would not destroy ordinary interaction, because humans already talk through distractions, bad acoustics, and misunderstanding. What disappears is the control that lets one signal arrive at the right moment. That control begins before a word is spoken. You notice the reaction, decide what it probably means, and check whether the first interpretation deserves to leave your head. Then you predict its effect, choose language, soften or sharpen it, and sometimes replace it entirely because the original version was incomplete or unfair. None of this requires a long silence. Most of it happens while the other person is still finishing their sentence. Across 10 languages, conversational responses peaked roughly 200 milliseconds after a question ended. 200 milliseconds is barely a pause, yet speakers still manage to prepare an answer, recognize the available turn, and enter without colliding with everyone else. Conversation works because people do not release every available signal. They select one, place it into a narrow opening, and adjust when the other person reacts. A raised eyebrow may change the next sentence. Confusion may trigger an explanation. Hurt may stop a remark that looked harmless a moment earlier. The pause is doing work, interpreting, predicting, restraining, and timing. Remove that layer, and the unrelated fragments from the meeting or dinner no longer remain background noise. They interrupt the chosen exchange before either person can manage them. Every stray reaction now arrives with the timing and social force of a reply, even though nobody decided to make it one. A compliment now arrives beside the comparison that produced it. "You look great," followed immediately by the face, outfit, or earlier version your mind used as a reference. The compliment may still be sincere, but the listener receives both pieces and has no reliable way to know which one deserves more weight. In a meeting, useful cooperation competes with boredom, resentment, private disagreement, and the temporary calculation of who has enough status to challenge the plan. On a date, each person hears the other's attraction mixed with self-consciousness, comparison, distraction, and the fear that the evening is already going badly. The anxiety becomes public, then immediately starts worrying about being public. At a family dinner, one flash of anger can revive an old argument before affection, proportion, or better judgment has time to catch up. Negotiation becomes even harder because every weak point, acceptable compromise, and fallback position appears before anyone chooses whether revealing it would help. The same ambiguity drives each failure. A passing fragment and a settled position may feel completely different inside the thinker, but they reach the listener as equally real information. Understanding that distinction intellectually would not cancel the emotional impact of hearing that someone compared you, doubted you, resented you, or briefly wanted to leave. There is an obvious benefit: deliberate lies, concealed motives, and planned manipulation would become much harder to maintain. But total access offers less privacy in exchange for supposedly greater trust. And trust is not a meter that automatically rises whenever more information appears. More information can help trust, but only when the act of sharing still belongs to the person who shares it. Voluntary disclosure carries meaning because you choose the audience, the timing, the words, and how much of the unfinished story you are ready to explain. Telling one trusted person about a fear can create closeness precisely because you could have kept it private and decided not to. The same fear, dragged in front of coworkers, relatives, strangers, or everyone nearby, is not a larger version of intimacy. It is exposure without control. Across 5 studies of romantic relationships, greater disclosure was associated with higher intimacy offline, but with lower intimacy when personal information was shared publicly online. The amount of information was not the only thing that mattered. Audience, context, and control changed what disclosure meant. Concealment can still create suspicion, and deliberate manipulation does not become trustworthy merely because privacy has value. Literal honesty is not the whole system either. A kind reassurance may support trust in someone's care, while slightly weakening trust in their complete accuracy. Trust has several parts: honesty, reliability, benevolence, and judgment. Maximum exposure can strengthen one while damaging another. But if nobody can control what leaves the mind, the obvious adaptation is to move the filter inward and stop unwanted thoughts before they appear. Moving the filter inward sounds possible until you try to control a thought before it exists. Standing beside someone, you attempt not to think anything insulting, sexual, anxious, embarrassing, or forbidden. To check whether the thought is appearing, however, you must keep searching for it, and that search keeps the subject mentally available. Checking whether a thought is gone requires remembering exactly what you are not supposed to think about. A meta-analysis found that deliberate thought suppression can produce a small to moderate rebound later, although the size of the effect varies with the thought and how researchers measure it. The forbidden material does not always return, and suppression is not equally ineffective for everyone, but there is no reliable internal mute button. Under universal broadcasting, every conversation could become a monitoring exercise. Scan the mind, detect the fragment, judge it, suppress it, then check again. That constant inspection would encourage exhaustion, shame, and avoidance, not because the thoughts reveal dangerous intentions, but because any mental noise could be mistaken for one. Removing external privacy would not produce disciplined minds. It would make people afraid of producing ordinary mental events near other people. Nobody can currently open a stranger's mind like a public live stream, but mental privacy is no longer discussed only as fiction. The next question is what real systems can actually decode. Current neural decoding is far narrower than the version in our hypothetical. Some systems can reconstruct broad meaning from brain activity, but only after extensive training with a cooperating participant whose patterns the system has already learned. Others decode attempted speech from someone deliberately trying to communicate, often for people who cannot speak normally. These are remarkable tools, but they are not opening random private thoughts or searching a stranger's mind for whatever happens to be there. They depend on calibration, cooperation, constrained targets, and output that can remain incomplete or inaccurate. A decoder may recover a signal without knowing whether the person meant to send it. In 2025, the American Psychological Association reaffirmed a right to mental privacy and called for legal protection of neural and cognitive data. The useful application may be restoring communication. The dangerous step is allowing assistance to become access without consent. Mental privacy needs protection before access becomes effortless. Establishing it afterward would be rather late. The deeper issue is not whether a mental fragment is embarrassing, but whether anyone else has the right to receive it before its owner has chosen what it means. Return to the friend with a new haircut, and the first involuntary fragment still arrives exactly as before. Oh no! The difference is the pause that normally follows, when you can ask whether the reaction is fair, temporary, useful, or even connected to what you truly think. Inside that brief space, a person can reject the fragment, examine it, translate it, or replace it with a response that is more accurate than the first mental reflex. The chosen answer might still be critical, uncertain, or awkward. Kindness does not require pretending, only deciding what you are actually willing to communicate. Privacy can hide lies, manipulation, and cruelty, which is why selective expression should never be confused with automatic goodness. But removing privacy entirely would erase the difference between something happening inside a mind and something a person chooses to do to someone else. Perhaps humans would eventually invent rules for ignoring leaked fragments, though it is hard to call access consensual when the owner never controlled it. More information would not necessarily give us more truth, because a mind needs somewhere for a thought to remain unfinished before it becomes communication.